It's funny how much of James Cameron's output is sparked by a simple image, an unyielding compulsion to make the world see what he sees in his mind's eye. The Terminator exists because one night he dreamed of a skeleton standing in a fire and he had to make that real. He needed us to see that image. In that same vein, the T-1000 and then groundbreaking special effect was realized basically because he thought that would look kinda cool too. It seems every time he has an idea for a neat new effect, a whole movie is made about it. And in much that same vein, when he was introduced to the Battle Angel or Gunmu series by Guillermo del Toro about 2 decades ago, he fell in love with the mental image of its protagonist in the real world, a shining, immaculate angel, enduring, unkillable, terrible in a way, and yes, having very large eyes, for better or worse. I hear he painted that at some point, but he knew the effects of the day could not recreate that image without it looking laughably dumb, so he bided his time until he released Avatar, essentially a tech demo for the effects that would one day make Alita real. And that was the next thing on his to-do list until Avatar became so obscenely popular that it distracted him from his first love. For years, fans like me worried we'd never see this film as it was put off again and again. The situation got so dire he had to hand the reins to Robert Rodriguez to finish it. And now, cracks and all, here it is. As you can imagine, when I saw early reviewers lament fans of Avatar who have awaited a sequel for so long and would have to settle for this, ooh, you can imagine how that stings. It's completely backwards. It's us Battle Angel fans who have had to sit and wait the longest for this film, that from a certain perspective is the one they always should have made. I understand that sounds a little entitled, but it takes some gall to call this movie the distraction. And to those perplexed by the movie's existence and dismissing it as meaningless incoherent pablum, wondering why we needed to see this character at all, why this movie ever needed to be made, I refer you to this video I made a year ago breaking down the significance of this character and her story, the universal themes explored, the tragedy of a relationship that was never going to last, how deftly the series subverts the Born Sexy Yesterday trope since the first trailer gave people the impression it was that kind of story, and the response has been overwhelming. But my favorite comments, the ones that really stuck out to me over the last year or so, were those expressing how Alita had always been there for them, and helped girls and women especially through tough times in their lives, really capturing what it feels like to grow up and have the whole world barking at you to be a certain way, to know your role, and breaking out of that mold to save themselves, inspired by Alita's words like, "Anything my arms can reach, in this space I am invincible." I related to Alita in different ways growing up. Being autistic, I had numerous stretches of time where if things got stressful, I'd start to regress, retreat inward, and reject the world, only to eventually muster the strength to step forward again. And seeing Alita take similar steps through her journey inspired me. Alita's an important character from an important series. She always has been, and to brush that off because it's a manga is just weird to me. I won't repeat everything I said then, but it might help for some viewers who still don't understand Alita to go back and watch that, and consider this review a part 2 to that analysis. And for the sake of transparency, I've been waiting for this movie for over 10 years. Every time a new tidbit was dropped that it might come out someday, my young heart would skip a beat. I remember them saying back in 2013 that it'd be out in 2018 or so, and I had this moment when I was sitting on a park bench with my elderly dog and it was getting dark, and I realized she'd be dead long before the movie finally came out. I realized a lot of things in my personal life would have to come and go before I'd ever get to see it, so I stopped thinking about it for a while. I tuned out because I felt bad looking forward to it, like it was wrong, and a lot has changed. But lately I found myself counting the days to the promised day, after all the delays, when this dream would become reality and I'd finally see it. I'm not one for anecdotes, but I'm throwing this out there to acknowledge that there is a chance, however slim the possibility, that I might be too emotionally invested in this movie for my own good. So if you want to dismiss this review because you think I'm blinded by bias, okay then, but I'll try not to be. Before I delve into the movie specifics, the characters, etc., I want to delve into its nature. Last time around, I worried people would call this a ripoff of Elysium simply because that flick with a very similar world was fortunate enough to hit theaters first. And lo and behold, that is exactly what happened despite also being quite backwards. In fact, Alita's been accused of borrowing from every sci-fi cyberpunk film of the last few decades when it's actually the other way around, even if not directly. I don't know how many of these critics are aware of this, but this is based on a manga from 1990. And a lot of things that may seem cliche and overdone now were not cliche in 1990. In a way, it being a 30-year-old manga story played completely straight makes it at odds with the West. There's a tendency for people making Western live-action adaptations of anime to skew away from the elements that make those stories so beloved around the rest of the world, out of shame and fear that such material uniquely won't resonate with Americans because we're weird like that. But it is those very elements that make such series bigger, more lasting, and more resonant than those half-baked movies will ever be. One exception was Speed Racer, a delightfully shameless movie that at the very least isn't afraid to admit what it is, and I'm charmed by that kind of spirit. There was also Pacific Rim, which, while not directly based on any one series, took the best elements of many and rolled them together into a beautifully shameless package. And for the first time since then, we have a film that fully embraces the awkward trappings of the series that inspired it, being the most faithful anime adaptation yet to grace our big screen. But that's a double-edged sword, as every single complaint of it being tropey, sequel-baity, erratically paced, and tonally all over the place are complaints you could make about most manga and anime. So if you think manga and anime are garbage for those reasons, I guess this makes sense. These cons are quite par for the course, because Japan's idea of good storytelling is quite different from Hollywood's. There's a very different method to their madness. In some respects, the series is inquisitive and layered, and in others it is quite unsubtle about its intentions, wearing its emotions and messaging naked on its sleeve. And that's a big part of manga's appeal for individuals like me. That unfiltered ugly rawness is why we like it. It's not the bug, it's the feature. But that won't jive with someone utterly entrenched up to their ears in Western sensibilities, thinking that our ways are always the best. And I think this is a big part of why Alita's counterparts had to mask what they were, water down and pervert the vision into something unrecognizable. Now, I'm not saying you just don't understand the culture, man. Well, I am also saying that, but more so I think these elements, the raw emotion, the flowery philosophizing, the childlike glee to show off an unflinching commitment to a vision, however goofy, are quite appealing on a very basic human level, and I simply think some people in a bubble of their own creation tend to lose sight of that feeling, of that humanity presented in a way that, in that bubble, seems incompatible with the West. So when you get such a pure, sincere translation like this, it's going to feel alien and weird to people with a very specific, very American idea of how a story is supposed to be told. Of course, films and books are very different, and what works well in one may not work in the other, so I'm not against switching some things around to make a tighter narrative. For example, without giving away anything the trailers didn't already, I much prefer the film's take on Alita's berserker body being recovered from a downed spaceship over Ito simply having a spare one collecting dust in a locker in the manga. I'm fine with Motorball being sprinkled here and there to add a little flavor to the world without eating up an entire second movie's runtime like it did in the manga. That's the kind of alteration I'm all for, but Battle Angel has a spirit to it that must shine through. Sure, it's not the kind of thing they teach you about in film school, but there's a reason people outside Hollywood and critics' fear of reference love this stuff. All around the world, works like Dragon Ball, Fist of the North Star, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure are much more mainstream than the Fast and the Furious will ever be. And worst case scenario, I imagine Alita may end up a sleeper hit like Pacific Rim, doing alright here, but faring better in other countries where I guess people just have better taste. In a sense, this is a film that should have come out a long time ago. Out of time, out of place, out of step. But is it good? Speaking as a series fan, it's a dream come true. But it's not perfect. Relax. I was a little skeptical when the first trailer dropped, but each subsequent release gave me more and more confidence in the film containing every crack and beauty spot that makes me love the comic. The first shots of Zalem raining refuse onto the city below, falling from heaven in a sense, immediately set the movie's tone. Rosa Salazar's performance is as much physical as it is vocal, and it makes for some great visual storytelling that fleshes her out in small but meaningful ways. She's certainly expressive. Big eyes or not, this is Rosa's face. She is smiling or gritting her teeth or guffawing or getting overwhelmed, and I kept forgetting that the effect was even there because I was so sucked into the story. Now understand that this film mainly focuses on volumes 1 and 2 of the manga, with some smatterings of elements from 3 and 4. At this time in her life, Alita is a fireball of messy emotions and indeed quite naive. She's quick to welcome companionship and gets excited over every little new thing. Her reactions to various experiences are intense if not extreme, be them positive or negative, to the point it's kind of cringy. You know, like a real person can get sometimes. Like when she's happy, she's really happy, and when she's upset, she makes no effort to conceal her rage. She wears her emotions on her sleeves, but throughout the movie, as she literally and figuratively peels back the layers of herself, she finds herself, adapting to her environment and honing herself to become more focused, balanced, and striking true. Every single thing she does and says in this movie serves that development, this growing maturity. Enduring her hardships throughout the film, she purifies herself like a fine blade until nothing can hold her back. If you come at her hard, she's just gonna come at you even harder. There's a scene early on where she's playing a game with some teens, one of them bullies her and she makes him fall on his butt. That's exactly the sort of thing she'd do in the comics, standing up for herself. I've heard people say they didn't find her relationship with Hugo believable, but I believed it. Awkward as it was, that's the point. It's supposed to be awkward and rushed, like a lot of relationships between young people tend to be. But as much as Alita herself tends to overdo everything in those days, there is still a surprising level of nuance to it. If there is anything that bugs me about Hugo, it's that he's played by some heartthrob. I liked Kian Johnson's performance, but part of the beauty of their relationship in the comic and the anime was that he was this rough but frail boy, a byproduct of a dirty claustrophobic environment that chewed him up and spat him out. Alita didn't stare at his abs through a window, she stared at his goofy, optimistic face. She was smitten because she was inspired by his unwillingness to let this cruel world beat him down despite him being so weak. And being so much stronger herself, she was reluctant to even hug him lest she accidentally tear him to shreds. It was a double beauty-beast dynamic. She looks like a beauty, but in a way is a beast, while he's this scarred but beautiful young soul she must protect. And I think if they just adjusted a few details like that in the movie, it just would have added another layer. Maybe not as many teens would find Hugo attractive, but they would still feel for him, maybe more. I do think the relationship is well done. You learn a lot about them as they continue to interact from scene to scene, but it could have done with a bit more texture. In fact, the setting is kinda like that too. It's still grimy, chipped at, and cluttered as it should be, but maybe not as much. We tend to focus on the nicer parts of it if there is any such thing. We won't, for example, get a scene where she's hanging out with a bunch of homeless dudes and one of them offers her a rat on a stick because that's all they had to eat. This aspect alone is enough to sink the movie for some fans, who feel it's completely missing the point of this brutal, harsh story by making the streets too clean. It's still a dirty, dangerous place in the movie, and there's plenty of gore, for those who are worried about that PG-13 rating dumbing it down. It's like 75% of the way there. Oh jeez, I'm starting to undersell this. Oh, I really love the dynamic between Alita and Ito. Understand that their relationship was always kinda creepy by design, though honestly it's a little less creepy here. Without spoiling anything, the father-daughter relationship is a bit more literal in a sense. They're not related, but you'll see what I mean. And this is one of those alterations I actually really like, and it added some extra depth to both of them, but Ito especially. In the comic and the anime, he was trying to keep her angelic, a very idealized vision of her in his mind that she simply couldn't live up to. But the movie improves on this in a way I never saw coming. It's not as much about trying to protect her from an ugly world so she can stay beautiful and uncorrupted. It's more so that his own life is so riddled with regret and self-loathing that he doesn't want her to also suffer that feeling. He doesn't want her to look back on her life and feel like she screwed up left and right, wish she'd done things differently. He envies her because whatever life she had before, she has a second chance. How many people would give up everything for a new start, a new life? But whether she throws that away or not is Alita's choice. That regret is a big part of being human, and she can't live a lie pretending to be an angel, pretending to be above us. And he comes to peace with that. He accepts her for what she is, and not what he wishes she could be. It's a very complicated dynamic that I think more than a few young people, but girls especially, may see themselves in. Going back to Alita herself, it's really something to see her transform throughout the movie. She could be downright vicious at times, rightfully so given some of the things that happened to her. Part of the character's appeal is her vulnerability. She's not indestructible. She's brittle and breaks time and again throughout the series only to come back stronger and more resolute than before. That's life. That's one of those universal concepts that makes a series so digestible, and I'm happy to see those kinds of moments do make it in. I was pleasantly surprised by Ed Skrein as Zapan, one of the villains. Zapan was always this smarmy, vindictive, self-important creep in the comics who I'd imagine being played by Nicolas Cage if this was released a decade or two ago, and because we didn't really get to see the guy act in the trailers, I was expecting to be underwhelmed. But while maybe not as hammy or performative, he is every bit that gets under your skin wicked and slimy that he is in the series. The other performances range from alright to pretty good. Jennifer Connelly was good as Shrin, a character that was made up for the anime and fans have always felt kinda so-so about, but wound up having a much stronger presence here. She feels a little more like a real person, and more in line with the original comic. Mahershala Ali looks and sounds the part as Vector, but I feel there was some wasted potential here. Just knowing he isn't going to get to do as much or be as effective in the long run, and how his ultimate undoing isn't really even his own. He does get plenty of moments to shine, all the essentials are there, but there's only so much that can be squeezed into a movie, and I would have liked to see a little more. I wish Nurse Gerhard, Ito's assistant played by Adara Victor, had a little more to say. Not saying she had to be a constant presence, but she's basically an extra, and her comic counterpart, this dude with half a head, somehow had more to say. He had a lot to say, and her extremely light presence makes her feel like a token, despite clearly being very involved in these characters' lives. But still, at least the main lead gets to be a woman of color this time, and saying she doesn't count because she passes is just erasing this actress, and that's pretty freaking gross in itself. But there is one thing related to race that really rubbed me the wrong way, and this is kind of a spoiler, but nothing comes of it. The Motorball arc is considered by many to be the weakest stretch of the original 9 volumes, but one of the best elements of it was Jashugan, a Motorball superstar on death's door who made a huge impact on Alita before going out in a blaze of glory and inspired her for years to come, igniting her warrior spirit. Also, he's black. And guess what? He's in the movie for a little bit. And he has the spinning arms and looks really cool. I was so excited to see him. Until they took off his helmet and he was the most generic, impersonable, uncharismatic white guy they could find. What the heck? He doesn't even get to say anything to Alita, and this is such an easy scene to do right. All they had to do was get John Boyega to play the motivational speaker type who sees something special in Alita and gives her a couple of pointers. Have him say something special that leaves an impact on her and makes a really feel-good scene. That's all they had to do. I mean, they went to the trouble of rendering an armored-up Jashugan motorballing around. How did they almost get this right? It's a glaring blemish that really bugged me in an otherwise very faithful movie. In fact, all of my critiques can really be boiled down to that. The film gets so many aspects so right, from the characters to their relationships to the story beats, that the few things they get wrong stand out. To me, at least. I might just be nitpicking. It's a remarkably paced movie, I'll say. I think it was almost 3 hours, but it flew by for me. Every scene gave me something to enjoy. I kept wanting more. A lot of people have been saying the action scenes are the best part of this movie. Honestly, the best part for me was the story, the characters and all that. But the action is amazing. What really makes it work is just how easy it is to keep track of things. There's a lot going on, but it's all so cleanly done, and there's such a nice flow to it that I never had a hard time looking at it. I never lost track of who was where or doing what. Some of the best action I've seen in a good long time, and it definitely does this series justice. They pretty much read passages from the comic word for word at points. And it's not simply that I like this stuff because that's what I know. I genuinely think it's good writing to this day. They take so many cues and even manage to include some characters I never expected to see this early in the story in clever, poignant ways I appreciated. It's sort of a greatest hits version of Alita, almost feeling like 3 or 4 episodes of a series mushed together in a movie, but not in a roundabout, unnatural way. The puzzle pieces fit together very well as one flows to the next, to the next, to the next until it's over. And that brings us to one last thing that could make or break the movie, for non-fans at least. A certain mad scientist fans were worried wouldn't even make it into the film does, in a big way. But if you're familiar with the books, you'll know he's mentioned a couple of times in Volume 1 and doesn't actually appear until Volume 5, right where this movie ends. So yes, all while everything else in this movie is going on, it builds up an eventual confrontation with Nova that simply can't happen yet, and isn't going to go down until the sequel. But as a fan, I always knew it was going to go that way. I'm happy he's in this film as much as he was. While I can see where people who are tired of every new movie setting up other movies and not finishing their story in one go are coming from, you can't make this movie a one and done. You can't tell Alita's entire story in one sitting, it's too big. I guess if they wanted, they could have left Nova out of the movie entirely, like the 45-minute anime did, and let the plot simply be Alita going about her life, which honestly sounds kind of nice. But then if they ever made a sequel, they'd have to build this guy up in a much shorter time, and it might feel like he came out of nowhere. Then again, I also understand those who wish the first movie picked up at a later point in her life where she's become more independent to avoid any Born Sexy Yesterday vibes completely. But imagine if the original series played out that way. Imagine if the first several volumes just didn't exist and we didn't get to know Alita before the really bad hardships begin. I think this movie did need to be made. This ground did need to be covered. But yeah, we better get a sequel. But even if we don't, I still think it went out on a high note. The real emotional punch for me in this very emotional story, the most important part, is the cable scene. And I'm not gonna say anything more about that. Zip. I said 2 Decembers ago that out of all the manga they could turn into a movie, this should be the easiest because there's very little they'd have to change to break those cultural barriers, barely anything really. But I was surprised by how much had changed by the end, and now I can't predict how a second Battle Angel is going to go. But I can think of a few ways that maybe I'll go over another time. If there's one thing I appreciate in film, something of value above all else, it's sincerity. If the person in the director's chair or doing the motion capture isn't having a good time, I can't. What makes the DCU's early films hard to watch now is this pervading sense of dread, an inescapable feeling that these people were, quite simply, ashamed to be making comic book movies, clasping their hands and wishing they could work on anything else, anything more elevated instead. And I think the success of Wonder Woman and even more so Aquaman are entirely owed to people finally embracing the material with genuine love for what it is. Aquaman is a pretty silly movie, but it's a very enjoyable movie for how shameless and committed it is to its campy vision, and I can't help but admire that deeply. There's something infectious about that kind of joy, that revelry, that's been completely missing from most of those other movies. In fact, I've been enjoying a lot of movies lately because they share that sincerity. For all their faults, just them finally ditching any pretense of not being what they are, this aversion towards the things people loved about those properties in the first place, is beautiful to me. And that joy is very present in Alita, if not more so than any of those others. It oozes it, it bleeds it. While it may not have perfectly captured every detail, it is legitimate, it is raw, and it is sublime. And it is miles better than any of its contemporaries. We finally got a good anime adaptation, really good. Don't let any little thing I picked apart in this video be enough to turn you off. There is so much more that it does right. This entire movie came to be because a few people thought this manga was kinda neat, and maybe more people should know about it. Rosa Salazar filled the entire first volume like a coloring book because she loves the character that much. It's a movie made by fans. Again, most of the complaints I've seen from others seem to be that it did stay pretty true to the manga, which just gave me more faith in the movie, made me want to see it even more, because that's what I came for. It's what I went to see, it's all I wanted. And I finally got it after all these years, and I loved it. But I understand not everyone is going to have such a rich and formed experience, and to that end I'll say, I still think it makes a good movie in its own right. I don't know what it is that's wrong with me, but I keep enjoying a lot of movies that other people deem shallow, lacking deep characterization, inconsistent, and I scratch my head because I don't know what they're talking about. Like, am I just projecting something onto the characters that isn't really there? Am I imagining they're deeper than they really are, creating subtext? I don't know. But even if you can't read between the lines, so to speak, there's a lot to love here, and I definitely recommend seeing it whether you're an Alita fan or not. I haven't been this immersed in a world since Fellowship of the Ring, and people didn't have a problem with that being the first movie in a planned trilogy. Why is this any different? I really hope this movie does well enough to justify the other two they're talking about, but they want to see how this goes first. So if for some reason it doesn't land, I guess that's on us. Fingers crossed. Well, that's all I got for now. For those new to my channel, in the coming weeks I'll be uploading the final season of my LEGO Rewind documentary series. And when that's done, I want to shift towards more content like this. Since my original Battle Angel video really kicked off my channel's recent growth, I feel I owe something to it. And there are plenty of other stories I want to pick apart and talk about, and I just hope people appreciate my opinions this time. I really tried to be balanced and not just gush for 20 minutes. But yeah, I love this movie, even with its flaws. I love the character, and I hope you enjoy this too. That's it for today. Toodles!